Did the Vikings really make a pact with the gods for eternal glory? To answer that question, we must first travel back over 1,000 years, to the icy coasts of Scandinavia where roaring seas, jagged mountains, and endless forests shaped a people as fierce as the land they called home. The Vikings were not simply pirates or raiders as popular culture often paints them. They were farmers, traders, explorers, and storytellers. Yet above all, they were warriors. Their world was one where strength was survival, where the edge of an axe determined fate, and where death itself was not an enemy but a passage to something greater. From the sagas and poems passed down through generations, we know that the Norse believed in a pantheon of gods unlike the distant deities of other cultures. Odin, the All-Father, sought wisdom at any cost, sacrificing even his eye to drink from the well of knowledge. Thor, the thunder god, wielded his mighty hammer Mjolnir to protect gods and men alike. Freya, goddess of love and war, received half the fallen in her hall while Odin took the other half to Valhalla. For the Viking warrior, this belief system was not abstract religion, it was a contract written in blood. If they fought bravely and died honorably in battle, they would be chosen by Odin's Valkyries, warrior maidens who swept across the battlefield like storm winds, lifting the souls of the worthy to Valhalla. There, in that vast hall with golden shields for a roof and spears for rafters, they would feast each night and fight each day, preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of time. To the Viking mind, this was not mythology. It was destiny. The sagas tell us that a man's life was measured not in years but in deeds. Cowards who died in bed would be condemned to hell, a dreary underworld of cold shadows. Heroes who died with a weapon in hand would rise again in Odin's hall. And so, from the very beginning of their raids, the Vikings carried with them the belief that each swing of the sword and each drop of blood spilled was part of a pact with their gods. But was this truly a pact, a conscious agreement with divine powers, or was it a cultural narrative shaped by poets and skalds to inspire courage? To explore this, we must look at the evidence both historical and mythological. Archaeologists have uncovered burial mounds across Scandinavia and the lands the Vikings touched. In these graves, warriors were laid to rest with weapons, shields, and sometimes even horses. Ships were used as coffins, filled with goods as if preparing for a journey. These burials suggest that the Vikings believed their dead were truly embarking on another existence, not fading into nothing. The presence of sacrificed animals, and at times even sacrificed servants or wives, points to a belief that the warrior would need company and protection in the afterlife. The sagas, though written centuries later, echo these rituals with detailed descriptions of Valhalla and the halls of the gods. Yet we must ask, did individual Vikings actually feel they had made a personal pact with Odin? Or was this simply the framework of their belief system, much like how medieval Christians fought under the promise of salvation? The truth is likely a mixture of both. When a Viking raised his axe and roared into battle, he was not merely fighting for loot or land. He was fighting for memory, for the song that would be sung after his death, for the Valkyrie who might lift him skyward. That pursuit of eternal glory transformed war into ritual, and death into triumph. One saga tells of a warrior mortally wounded, who laughed as he fell, declaring he could hear the wings of the Valkyries already. To him, death was not loss but victory. But how much of this was belief and how much was propaganda? Did chieftains and poets spread the promise of Valhalla to drive men into hopeless fights? Were these stories tools of power as much as matters of faith? Already, in this opening chapter of our exploration, we see the line between myth and reality blur. The Vikings certainly believed in their gods, but they also understood the power of story. Skalds, the poets of the North, were as vital as warriors. They preserved tales of Odin's bargains, Thor's battles, Loki's treacheries. They gave words to the courage of fallen men, transforming bloody deaths into eternal fame. For the Viking, to die forgotten was a fate worse than hell itself. To die remembered, to have one's name carved into stone or sung in a saga, was true immortality. Thus, the pact with the gods may have been less about literal bargains and more about a cultural agreement. If you fight bravely, you will be remembered, and in that memory lies eternity. Yet still, questions remain. Did the Vikings believe Odin himself demanded their service in Ragnarok? Did they feel bound to fight so that the gods would reward them? Or was Valhalla more a symbol, a poetic expression of the human desire to make sense of death? As we continue this journey, we will peel back the layers of saga and soil, exploring whether the Norse pact with the gods was divine covenant or human invention. For now, know this: to the Viking, every swing of the axe and every scream on the battlefield was a prayer. Every drop of blood was an offering, and every death was a chance to step into eternity. Their lives were a wager, and the prize was nothing less than glory everlasting. To understand whether the Vikings truly believed they made a pact with the gods, we must look closely at the rituals that define their lives and deaths. Belief in Valhalla and eternal glory was not simply an idea whispered in halls. It was reinforced through sacrifices, oaths, and ceremonies that bound the community together. In the Viking world, sacrifice was central. Known as blot, these offerings were acts of devotion, meant to strengthen the bond between mortals and gods. Animals, horses, cattle, pigs, goats, were slaughtered during feasts, their blood collected in bowls and sprinkled on altars, temples, and even participants, a practice known as hlotbali. This blood was sacred, a symbol of life given to the gods in exchange for prosperity, victory, or safe passage. Yet animals were not the only offerings. The sagas and accounts from outsiders, such as Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, describe scenes where humans were sacrificed, particularly slaves or captives. These lives, taken in ritual, were believed to be offerings of immense power, carrying the souls of the slain to accompany warriors or leaders into the next world. Archaeological evidence from bogs and burial sites across Scandinavia shows bound skeletons, decapitated heads, and other signs of ritual killing, supporting the grim reality that blood was indeed spilled for the gods. Oaths were another powerful way Vikings tied themselves to divine destiny. Sworn upon weapons, rings, or sacred stones, these vows were not taken lightly. To swear an oath before Odin was to invoke his eye and his ravens as witnesses, to risk not only dishonor but spiritual damnation if broken. Warriors often swore oaths before battle, to fight until death, to take vengeance, to offer their deeds to the gods. In this sense, the pact was not metaphorical but contractual. They believed Odin would accept their courage as payment, and in return grant them entry into Valhalla. The cult of Odin in particular reveals the intimacy of this pact. Odin himself was a god of bargains, sacrifice, and secrets. He hung himself on the world tree, Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, to gain the knowledge of runes. He gave an eye to drink from Mimir's well. In return for wisdom, he paid in flesh and blood. Thus his worshippers mirrored him. Warriors sometimes wounded themselves before battle, spilling blood as a symbolic offering. The most extreme form of this imitation was the Odin's sacrifice, where a man was hanged and pierced with a spear, exactly as the god had done. These sacrifices were said to send the victim directly to Odin, a terrifying but honorable death. Archaeologists have found evidence of such rituals at sites like Uppsala in Sweden, where chroniclers described great feasts and human sacrifices performed in sacred groves. Here, every 9 years, it is said 9 of every creature, including men, were offered to the gods, hung from trees as a gift to Odin. Whether exaggerated or not, these accounts underscore how closely the Norse linked blood and oaths with divine reward. Yet the pact with the gods was not only about death. Everyday life was bound by ritual. Farmers prayed to Freyr for fertile fields, sailors to Njord for safe seas, craftsmen to Thor for protection. Offerings of food, ale, or weapons were left at sacred sites, stones, or mounds. To live was to constantly negotiate with the divine, to keep the favor of gods who were as fickle as they were mighty. But the warrior's path was distinct. The very act of raiding, so central to Viking identity, can be seen as ritual. When longships launched, they were blessed with sacrifice. Warriors painted shields, carved runes, and carried amulets of Thor's hammer or Odin's ravens. They did not sail blindly into danger. They sailed under the conviction that their actions were part of a cosmic cycle. To die with honor was to fulfill their side of the bargain. A famous example comes from the account of a Viking funeral witnessed by Ibn Fadlan in 922 AD. When a chieftain died, his ship was prepared for burning, filled with goods, weapons, and animals. But more shocking was the sacrifice of a slave girl who volunteered to join him. She was treated like a bride, drinking heavily, visiting each of the men to symbolize union with the community, and finally, she was killed with ritual precision, stabbed and strangled, so she could accompany her master to Valhalla. This gruesome scene shows the depth of Viking conviction. Death was not the end but a journey, and companions were necessary for that voyage. If the chieftain's soul was truly bound for Odin's hall, then this sacrifice was part of the pact. Yet skepticism lingers. Did all Vikings believe so literally in Valhalla, or was it an ideal upheld by elites and poets? Not every burial was grand or warrior-like. Many graves show simple goods, humble lives, no sign of Valhalla's grandeur. Perhaps the pact was a privilege reserved for the warrior class, a story to inspire young men to fight and die bravely. Still, even the poorest Viking likely believed in some form of afterlife, for the Norse cosmos was rich with possibilities. If not Valhalla, then perhaps Folkvanger, the field of Freya, where half of the slain went. If not there, then hell, not necessarily a place of punishment but a cold shadow of existence. To them, the universe was alive with fate, destiny woven by the Norns, the weavers of time. And in that tapestry, every oath, every cut of the blade, every spilled drop of blood was a thread binding men to gods. The pact was thus both spiritual and social. Warriors fought not only for their own glory but for their families, their clans, their skalds who would sing of their deeds. To break in battle was to shame not just oneself but one's people. To die bravely was to lift them all, to ensure their names lived on. This was the ultimate currency of the pact: memory. And in memory, men became immortal. As we examine these rituals of blood and oaths, the question becomes clearer. The Vikings may not have signed parchments with the gods, but their sacrifices, vows, and lives were written in blood upon the canvas of their culture. Their pact was not an illusion. It was lived reality, reinforced every time an animal bled at the altar, every time a warrior raised his axe and swore he would never flee. To them, it was truth. To us, it is myth. But in the space between truth and myth lies the eternal question. Did they truly believe Odin and the gods held their side of the bargain? For the Vikings, battle was more than survival, conquest, or profit. It was the crucible in which honor was forged and the stage upon which their pact with the gods was enacted. To the outside world, raids appeared as savage assaults, but to the Norse warrior, every clash of blades and every drop of blood was part of a cosmic drama. Glory in battle was the truest currency of their culture, the one path that could secure both memory on earth and eternity in Valhalla. When Viking longships struck the coasts of England, Ireland, or Francia, their warriors surged ashore with fury. Monks who chronicled these raids described terror, fire, and desecration, but what they failed to see was the conviction that burned in Viking hearts. These men did not rush into death blindly. They believed death in battle was a triumph. To fall with sword in hand was to fulfill the pact with Odin. Such faith made them terrifying enemies, for they did not fear the blade. They welcomed it if it meant glory. In skaldic poems, the battlefield was painted as Odin's domain, a place where Valkyries rode through smoke, choosing the slain. The slain were described as guests of Odin, their blood mead for the gods. To the Viking, fighting was sacred. A man's worth was measured not by wealth or long years, but by courage when the shield wall broke. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson recounts warriors laughing as arrows struck them, mocking death itself. Such behavior was not madness but devotion. To die with laughter was to prove worthy of Valhalla. Symbols of this pact were etched into their weapons and worn on their bodies. Thor's hammer amulets were common, invoking divine strength. Runes carved into swords and spears asked Odin for victory. Shields bore painted designs that were more than decoration. They were prayers in wood and pigment. Before raids, rituals prepared warriors for combat. Sacrifices of animals were made, blood sprinkled on weapons, and oaths sworn upon sacred rings. To break such an oath was unthinkable, for it would sever the warrior's bond not only with his comrades but with the gods themselves. Thus, the battlefield was bound by both honor and religion. Central to this was the concept of drengskapur, manly virtue, bravery, loyalty. A warrior who showed fear disgraced himself and his kin. Cowards were said to go not to Valhalla but to hell, a shadowy afterlife devoid of glory. Better to fall on foreign soil than to live with shame. This cultural pressure created a society where reckless courage was praised, where men hurled themselves into hopeless fights to prove themselves. Stories abound of last stands, where a handful of Vikings fought until overwhelmed, remembered not as fools but as heroes. One saga tells of a warrior mortally wounded who laughed and shouted that he already heard the Valkyrie's wings. In such tales, the pact with the gods was visible, tangible, undeniable. Yet historians caution that not every Viking lived this ideal. Many were farmers or traders who raided seasonally. Did they all believe so literally in Valhalla? Perhaps not, but the warrior elite shaped the narrative. For them, the promise of eternal battle and feast was the highest reward, and their ideals spread across society through sagas and songs. Even ordinary men were inspired, for who would not want to be remembered? Archaeological finds support the martial focus. Graves often include weapons even for young men, as if ensuring they were armed for the next world. Stones raised in memory often praise courage and travels, not wealth. Inscriptions proclaim men as brave fighters, anchoring their memory in public space. The battlefield was thus the proving ground for both faith and fame. Consider the berserkers, legendary warriors who fought in trance-like rage, biting their shields, howling like wolves, striking with inhuman fury. Some believe they used hallucinogens, others that their frenzy was ritual. Whatever the cause, they embodied surrender to Odin. To fight as a berserker was to become Odin's beast, chosen for Valhalla. Enemies feared them as demons, but to their own people they were living symbols of the pact. Yet we must also recognize the political utility of belief. Chieftains and jarls needed men willing to risk everything. By promising eternal glory, they ensured loyalty and fearlessness. Valhalla was thus both genuine conviction and social tool. Warriors embraced it sincerely, leaders wielded it strategically. But does that diminish its power? Not at all. Belief, whether exploited or not, shaped action. Facing men who sought death as reward was to face terror itself. Opponents often described Vikings as reckless, but this recklessness was calculated. To them, death was not defeat. Every raid was rehearsal for Ragnarok. Every fallen warrior a soldier gained for Odin. Even in defeat, they found victory, for to fall bravely was to win eternity. This mindset explains much of their success. They were not the most numerous, nor the best armed, yet their ferocity carved empires from England to Byzantium. Their fearlessness was both psychological weapon and spiritual creed. Not all Vikings could die in battle, of course. Many lived long lives, but even in old age, some sought a warrior's end. Sagas describe elders dueling to ensure they died with sword in hand. For them, life was incomplete without sealing the pact. Death in bed was dishonor. Death in combat was transcendence. Thus, the battlefield was more than geography. It was sacred ground where men proved themselves before gods and men alike. Each fight was a prayer, each wound a sacrifice, each death an ascension. The Vikings truly believed that glory in battle was the key to eternity. And whether Odin existed or not, their courage made it real. For as long as their names are sung, their pact endures. Among all the myths that shaped the Viking pact with the gods, none was more powerful or haunting than the Valkyries. These enigmatic figures, half divine and half terrifying, embodied the bridge between life and eternity. To the Norse, Valkyries were not distant fantasies but active presences, striding across battlefields, choosing who would fall and who would rise to Odin's hall. Their very name meant choosers of the slain, and that was their sacred function. When warriors clashed in shield walls, when steel rang against steel and blood soaked the earth, the Vikings believed unseen eyes watched them. A man's courage or cowardice was judged not only by his comrades but by these spectral maidens. To die bravely was to be lifted by Valkyries. To die in fear was to be abandoned. Skaldic poetry paints them vividly. They ride swift horses, their armor shining like lightning, their spears flashing like stars. They move through the smoke of battle, invisible yet felt. Some poems describe them weaving the web of war, a gruesome tapestry strung with human intestines, swords as shuttles, arrows as threads. As they wove, so too did men fall. This imagery was not metaphor to the Viking mind. It was reality cloaked in poetry. Every clash was a loom of fate, every corpse a knot in the web. Archaeological evidence hints at their influence. Small figurines of armored women have been found in graves, perhaps tokens of Valkyries. Amulets and carvings invoke their power. Such objects show that warriors carried the presence of Valkyries with them, trusting in their favor. The sagas tell of heroes who saw Valkyries in visions before battle, promising death but also glory. One tale speaks of a warrior who, mortally wounded, laughed that he could see the maidens already, their wings dark against the sun. His companions believed him, spreading the story as proof of his honor. In this way, visions became communal truth. The Valkyries were terrifying because they stripped men of control. A warrior could fight with all his might, yet if the Valkyrie chose him, no skill could save him. But this lack of control was not despair, it was acceptance. The Vikings believed in fate, woven by the Norns, unbreakable even by gods. Odin himself was destined to die at Ragnarok. Thus, the Valkyrie's choice was not arbitrary but part of cosmic law. To resist was useless. To embrace was strength. In this sense, the pact with the gods was less about bargaining and more about surrender. To fight bravely was to show readiness for whatever fate decreed. If chosen, one ascended to Valhalla. If spared, one fought another day. Either way, courage was demanded. Yet Valkyries were not always benevolent. Some sagas show them as doombringers, steering battles to slaughter. They could favor one side, ensuring victory, or doom another, ensuring death. To invoke them was risky, for their loyalty was to Odin and fate, not to men. Still, to be ignored by them was worse. The greatest fear was not death but obscurity. Dying without being chosen, condemned to hell, forgotten by saga and song. Families took comfort in Valkyries too. When sons or husbands fell in battle, it was easier to believe they had been chosen than abandoned. To say a warrior was taken by Valkyries gave meaning to grief, turning tragedy into honor. Communities reinforced this by telling stories, carving runes, and raising stones. The pact was thus communal, a shared belief that courage ensured transcendence. Valhalla itself was described in vivid detail. A vast hall with spears for rafters, shields for tiles, benches overflowing with mead, and a boar slaughtered each day, reborn by night. There warriors fought each morning, feasted each evening, wounds healed at dawn. It was a paradise of struggle, reflecting the Viking love of battle. But half of the slain went not to Odin but to Freya, goddess of love and war, in her field folkvanger. This dual destiny reinforced the idea that men could not demand their reward. They were chosen, divided by divine will. The pact was therefore humbling. Men could only offer courage, never guarantee reward. Still, the promise was enough. The belief that Valkyries watched, that glory was possible, drove men into feats of recklessness. It turned battle into theater, each warrior performing not only for comrades but for gods. Some modern scholars argue that Valkyries were symbols, poetic inventions to inspire. But to dismiss them as metaphor misses the point. In the Viking worldview, myth and reality were inseparable. Thunder was not caused by Thor, it was Thor. Likewise, Valkyries were not symbols of death. They were death embodied. To see them was not hallucination but revelation. The pact with the gods was thus enforced by the Valkyries' gaze. They were judges, messengers, executioners, and redeemers. Their wings shadowed every battlefield. Their spears pointed to eternity. And though men could not control their choice, they could control their bravery. In that bravery lay freedom, and in that freedom lay glory. For the Viking, to be chosen was the highest honor, and to believe in the Valkyries was to embrace the truth that death was never the end but the gateway to immortality. At the center of the Viking imagination stood Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the ultimate destiny of both mortals and immortals. For the Norse, Ragnarok was not a distant legend meant to entertain, but a terrifying prophecy woven into their worldview, shaping their sense of honor, their acceptance of death, and their pact with the gods. While Christians in medieval Europe were promised heaven or hell, the Vikings were promised battle, fire, destruction, and eventually renewal. Far from causing despair, this gave their lives urgency and meaning. In the Norse cosmos, even the gods were doomed. Odin himself, the All-Father, would be devoured by Fenrir, the monstrous wolf. Thor would slay the Midgard serpent, Jormungandr, but die from its venom moments later. Freyr would fall to Surtur, the fire giant, because he had foolishly given away his sword. Loki, once blood brother of Odin, would lead the giants and monsters against the Aesir, commanding chaos in rebellion. Heimdall would blow the Gjallarhorn to signal the final battle, only to die fighting Loki in single combat. The world tree Yggdrasil would shake, the heavens would split, and the seas would rise in floods. The sun would be swallowed by wolves, stars would vanish, and the earth itself would burn. Yet from this apocalypse, a new world was foretold. Green, fertile, reborn after destruction. This paradox, doom followed by renewal, gave Vikings a unique perspective on life and death. For them, mortality was inevitable, but courage was eternal. If even gods could not escape fate, then mortals had no reason to fear it. Courage was the only true currency of existence. This is where the pact with the gods found its sharpest edge. Warriors believed that by dying bravely in battle, they were not simply ending their lives, but joining Odin in Valhalla to train for Ragnarok. Each day in Valhalla, the dead fought, their wounds healed, and each night they feasted, drinking mead from the udders of the goat Erne and eating the ever-reborn boar Sarimnir. It was not paradise of peace but paradise of struggle, endless preparation for the final war. Thus, the pact was not a promise of rest but a promise of purpose. A man who lived without courage risked obscurity and hell, a dreary underworld of shadows. A man who died with courage ensured his place at Odin's side in the last, greatest battle. Archaeological evidence supports this worldview. Graves filled with weapons, shields, and sometimes even sacrificed horses suggest warriors were being equipped for battle beyond death. Stones and carvings often show imagery of wolves, serpents, and flames, reminders of Ragnarok's inevitability. Such symbols were not abstract art but reflections of belief, woven into daily life. Skaldic poetry reinforced this conviction. Poems described warriors laughing at wounds, seeking death without fear, eager to join the ranks of the Einherjar, Odin's chosen. To fall was not failure but graduation. Even enemies recognized this fearlessness. Chronicles from England and Francia tell of Vikings charging fearlessly, unwilling to retreat even in hopeless battles. Facing men who sought death as victory was a terrifying prospect. This mindset, born of Ragnarok, gave the Norse their edge. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok illustrates this perfectly. Thrown into a pit of snakes by King Erela, Ragnar is said to have laughed, declaring that his sons would avenge him and that he would soon feast in Valhalla. His words reveal more than bravado. They reveal a worldview where death was not defeat but fulfillment. Such stories became cultural fuel, teaching each new generation that courage was the path to glory. Yet not all Vikings were warriors. Many were farmers, traders, or craftsmen. Did they too see Ragnarok as their destiny? The evidence suggests yes, though in different ways. While warriors dreamed of Valhalla, others might have seen themselves in the rebirth of the world after Ragnarok. To endure hardship, to raise families despite winters and hunger, was to participate in the same cycle of destruction and renewal. Still, the warrior's ideal dominated. Courage in death remained the highest honor, and sagas celebrated it endlessly. The prophecy of Ragnarok also had a sobering effect. It reminded the Vikings that nothing was eternal, not even their gods. Unlike faiths that promised eternal divine order, the Norse believed in divine mortality. Odin could die, Thor could die, the world could burn, But this made courage and loyalty even more precious. If gods themselves faced doom bravely, then men were expected to do no less. The pact with the gods was thus not an escape from fate but an embrace of it. To die bravely was to mirror Odin, who sacrificed himself for wisdom, and Thor, who fought the serpent knowing he would die. In this sense, warriors imitated their gods in both life and death. Some scholars argue that this fatalism was a form of social control, encouraging men to fight recklessly for their leaders. But to the Vikings themselves, it was truth. Stories told around firelit halls, carvings etched into stone, rituals performed at sacrifices, all pointed to the same destiny. The gods demanded courage, and men supplied it. For in return they were granted eternal battle, eternal feast, and a role in the final cosmic struggle. This belief system gave the Vikings a kind of immortality. Even if they died far from home, their courage secured their legacy. Their names would be sung by skalds, their souls would fight at Ragnarok, and their deeds would echo through generations. And in the end, after fire and darkness, when the new world rose, perhaps their memory would rise too. For the Norse, Ragnarok was not despair but hope. The promise that life had meaning, that death had purpose, and that glory was eternal. Their pact with the gods was written not in parchment but in courage, not in ink but in blood. And in every battle, every raid, every sacrifice, they renewed it. The twilight of the gods was also the dawn of Viking immortality. When people imagine the Vikings, they often see only warriors with axes, ships slicing through waves, and battles fought in foreign lands. Yet the majority of Vikings were not constantly raiding. Most lived as farmers, herders, traders, and craftsmen. They planted barley, rye, and oats. They raised cattle, goats, and sheep. They built homes of timber and turf, and they tended families through long winters. Yet even in this daily life, the pact with the gods and the promise of something beyond death permeated every action. For the Norse worldview was not divided neatly between sacred and ordinary. Every task, from sowing a field to launching a ship, carried spiritual meaning. Farmers prayed to Freyr for fertility, sailors left offerings to Njord before voyages, and craftsmen invoked Thor to protect their work. To live as a Viking was to live constantly aware of divine presence. The gods were not distant. They were immediate, reflected in thunder, in storms, in dreams. But for all, the shadow of death loomed. Life was precarious. Harsh winters, poor harvests, disease, and accidents could strike at any time. Against this backdrop, the idea of eternal glory was powerful. If life was fragile, legacy became everything. To be remembered through story or to ascend to Valhalla gave meaning where survival alone could not. Children were raised on sagas. Around firelit halls, skalds recited tales of heroes who died with courage and were rewarded by Valkyries. These stories served as education, shaping values from youth. Boys were told that death in battle was not an end but a beginning. Girls were told that bravery, loyalty, and sacrifice were honored too, and that women who died in childbirth were sometimes likened to warriors, giving life with the same courage men gave in war. In this way, the pact with the gods extended to all, though in different forms. Archaeological evidence supports this. Rune stones often record deeds of courage rather than wealth. Inscriptions praise those who died in the East or fought bravely in foreign lands. Memory mattered more than possessions. To die forgotten was shame. To die remembered was triumph. Even in simple graves, amulets of Thor's hammer or figurines of Valkyries suggest hope for divine protection beyond life. The concept of honor structured daily choices. A man who broke oaths or fled from battle not only disgraced himself but risked eternal obscurity. Cowards would be shunned, their names unspoken. Meanwhile, men of courage would be sung in sagas, their memory carved in stone, their souls welcomed by Odin. This pressure shaped communities. Even in peaceful years, men trained with weapons, joined in hunts, or tested themselves in mock combat. To be ready for war was to be ready for death, and to be ready for death was to be worthy of Valhalla. Women, too, carried belief in the pact. They managed households, farmed alongside men, and kept families alive through hardship. But they also wielded spiritual influence. Women often performed rituals, interpreted dreams, and served as seeresses. The Valva or prophetess held great power, believed to speak with the gods. She reminded communities of fate, reinforcing the idea that destiny was woven by divine hands. Her words could comfort or terrify, but always they kept the pact alive in daily thought. Traders carried faith with them across seas. Vikings reached Byzantium, the Middle East, and even North America. Yet wherever they traveled, they wore Thor's hammer amulets, carved runes on ships, and offered sacrifices before voyages. For them, fortune in trade was linked to divine favor just as much as fortune in war. To succeed meant the gods had blessed them. To fail meant payment was lacking. Thus, even commerce carried echoes of the pact. But the warrior ideal overshadowed all. Even men who farmed most of their lives longed for death with weapon in hand. Sagas describe old men who sought duels to ensure a warrior's end. To die in bed was dishonor. To die in combat was exaltation. This created tension. Not everyone could die heroically. Yet the myth persisted, shaping culture. Those who could not achieve Valhalla still honored those who did, preserving their stories, ensuring immortality through memory. In this sense, the pact was communal. A single man's courage uplifted his clan. His death became their pride, his saga their inheritance. To remember was to fulfill their part of the pact. The promise beyond life extended to women as well. While Valhalla was the destination of warriors, Freya's hall Folkvanger welcomed many of the slain. Some believed women, especially those of great courage, could go there. Others believed their strength lived on through family, their names carried in lineage and story. Either way, the pact included them, for Norse faith was woven into every aspect of life. Feasts and rituals reinforced this constantly. At block gatherings, animals were sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on people and idols, binding the community together. Ale was drunk in honor of gods and ancestors, stories retold of heroes and battles. Each retelling was not entertainment but renewal of faith. Children learned, adults remembered, elders ensured continuity. The pact with the gods was thus sustained not only on battlefields but in barns, halls, and marketplaces. To live daily life as a Viking was to live within myth. Thunder was Thor. Ravens were Odin's eyes. Dreams carried messages. Death was never far, but neither was eternity. Each act of courage, loyalty, or sacrifice was part of the bargain. And though not all could die in battle, all could live with honor, and in living so, they fulfilled their role. This worldview explains why the Viking culture produced such resilience. Hardship was constant, but despair was rare, because every struggle had meaning. To work, to raise children, to fight, to die, all were strands in the web of fate, watched by gods, judged by Valkyries. The daily life of a Viking was ordinary in labor but extraordinary in meaning. For beneath every task lay the shadow of the eternal. The pact was not distant. It was woven into the soil they tilled, the ships they built, the meals they shared. And in every act, they prepared for the promise beyond. Glory, memory, and perhaps a place in the halls of the gods. If there was one practice that revealed how serious the Vikings were about their pact with the gods, it was sacrifice. To the Norse, sacrifice was not a symbolic gesture but a necessary payment, a literal transfer of life, wealth, and blood to maintain balance with divine powers. The word for sacrifice, blot, encompassed feasting, ritual, and bloodshed, binding communities together while also binding them to Odin, Thor, Freya, and the Pantheon. At the heart of this belief was the conviction that the gods demanded offerings and that mortals who gave generously would receive prosperity, protection, and victory in return. Animals were the most common sacrifices. Horses, goats, pigs, and cattle were killed in ceremonies where their blood was collected in bowls and sprinkled on idols, altars, and the participants themselves. This sprinkling, known as hlotbali, was sacred. Blood was life, and by sharing it with the gods, the community renewed its covenant. Archaeology at sites like Hofstad in Iceland has uncovered remains of feasts where animal bones bear marks of ritual slaughter, confirming that such ceremonies were widespread. Yet not all sacrifices were of animals. Written sources from Christian chroniclers and travelers describe more chilling offerings. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, claimed that at Uppsala in Sweden, every 9 years a great sacrifice was held in which 9 of every creature, including humans, were given to the gods. Victims were hanged from sacred trees or drowned in wells, echoing Odin's own sacrifice upon Yggdrasil when he hung for 9 nights to gain the wisdom of runes. Archaeological finds of human remains in bogs, bound or decapitated, lend weight to these accounts. Though exaggeration is possible, the presence of human sacrifice cannot be dismissed. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab envoy who witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga in 922, described how a slave girl volunteered to accompany her chieftain into death. Treated like a bride for the afterlife, she was plied with drink, symbolically united with the men of the community, and finally killed by ritual strangulation and stabbing before being laid beside her master on the burning ship. To modern eyes this is brutality, but to the Vikings it was necessity. The chieftain needed attendance in Valhalla, and the gods required the ultimate price. Weapons and treasures, too, were sacrificed. Hordes of swords, shields, and even entire ships have been found deliberately sunk in bogs or rivers, never to be used again. Such offerings symbolized surrender of earthly wealth to gain divine favor. For a warrior, giving up his best sword was not waste but investment, ensuring Odin's blessing in battles to come. The Norse myth of Odin reinforced this exchange. Odin was a god who sacrificed constantly. His eye for wisdom, his body upon the tree, his dignity in quests for knowledge. His followers mirrored him, offering parts of their lives or lives of others to demonstrate loyalty. In this sense, sacrifice was the truest expression of the pact. Mortals gave blood because the gods had given theirs. Ritual feasts linked sacrifice to community. The slaughtered animals were cooked, ale was poured, and the entire gathering became sacred communion. To eat together after offering to the gods was to share life with the divine. Children watched, learning that their existence depended on this bond. Women, often the ones preparing feasts, reinforced the cycle, turning domestic labor into religious act. But sacrifice was not only communal, it was also personal. Warriors sometimes cut themselves before battle, spilling a few drops of blood to dedicate the fight to Odin. Others swore oaths upon weapons, knowing that breaking such promises meant losing divine favor. To bleed willingly was to prepay for Valhalla. Some sagas tell of warriors offering themselves directly. In imitation of Odin, a man might hang himself or stab himself with a spear as ritual death. Though rare, these acts showed that ultimate sacrifice was seen as ultimate devotion. The pact demanded courage, and courage sometimes meant offering not just enemies' lives but one's own. Still, sacrifice carried ambivalence. Were the gods truly demanding these offerings, or were humans projecting their fears? Did leaders exploit belief to justify killing captives or slaves? Modern scholars debate this, but for the Vikings themselves the answer hardly mattered. What mattered was that sacrifice gave certainty. To spill blood was to balance the cosmos, to assure the gods noticed. It gave meaning to loss and justified violence as sacred exchange. Families took comfort in sacrifice, believing their offerings secured protection for fields, ships, and children. Communities believed that without it, crops might fail or storms might sink fleets. In this way, sacrifice was insurance policy and spiritual duty combined. The ultimate price revealed the depth of the Viking Pact. It was not casual faith, not passive prayer. It demanded real cost. Animals, treasures, human lives. Every sacrifice renewed the contract. Every drop of blood said, "We give so that you give." The gods, too, were bound, for if they failed to respond, faith itself would fracture. Yet the persistence of Norse religion for centuries suggests people believed the bargain worked. Harvests followed offerings, victories followed blots, and deaths in sacrifice were honored as necessary. To the Vikings, the gods kept their side. To us, it may seem cruel or delusional, but within their worldview it was justice. Thus, sacrifice was both proof and renewal of the pact. It was the visible price of eternal glory, the ultimate reminder that the Vikings did not merely hope for favor, they paid for it. Their pact with the gods was written in blood, sealed with fire, and remembered in story. And as long as sacrifices continued, the covenant endured. If sacrifice was the blood of the Viking Pact with the gods, then story was its voice. Without the songs of skalds, the carvings on rune stones, and the sagas told by firelight, the idea of eternal glory would have died with each fallen warrior. Instead, it survived, grew, and defined the Norse people, ensuring that their pact with the gods was not only spiritual but cultural. In Viking society, the skald was as essential as the warrior. These poets memorized vast verses and recited them at feasts, battles, and funerals. Their role was not mere entertainment but preservation of honor. A warrior who fought bravely was worthless if forgotten, but if a skald sang his deeds, his name lived forever. In this way, memory became a second Valhalla, one that even those who did not die in battle could reach. To be sung was to be immortal. Skaldic poetry was dense, filled with kennings, poetic metaphors that wrapped meaning in layers of imagery. Blood became battle sweat, swords were Odin's fire, ravens were the feeder's guests. These kennings turned violence into poetry, elevating death from brutality to beauty. To die on the battlefield was not to rot in mud but to become part of a poem that connected men to gods. Even runestones echoed this purpose. Across Scandinavia, stones carved with inscriptions praised bravery and voyages. Some told of men who died in the east, in Constantinople or along the Volga. Others spoke of those who fought bravely and fell. These stones were public memory, physical sagas etched into the landscape, visible reminders of the pact. They told communities that courage was rewarded with eternal remembrance. To die forgotten was hell. To die remembered was Valhalla. Oral tradition carried this even further. Around hearths, children heard of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, of Ragnar Lothbrok, of heroes whose deaths became triumphs. Each retelling was an education. Boys learned that courage secured glory. Girls learned that loyalty and sacrifice were honored. By the time they reached adulthood, the pact was already woven into their identity. The sagas themselves blur history and myth. They tell of real battles and real men, but also of Odin appearing in disguise, of Valkyries riding through the smoke, of fate woven into every strike of the sword. To modern readers, this mixture of fact and fiction seems confusing. To the Vikings, it was natural. Myth was not separate from life but part of it. If Odin guided a warrior's blade in a saga, that was as real as the battle itself. Memory itself was sacred. Forgetting was worse than death. The greatest insult was to erase a man's name, to let his deeds fade. Conversely, the greatest honor was to have one's story told for generations. Families invested in this. They paid skalds to compose verses, raised stones to carve names, and passed tales through lineage. In doing so, they fulfilled their side of the pact. The community promised memory, the warrior promised courage. This reciprocity made the pact stronger than mere belief. It was a social contract enforced by culture itself. Even enemies contributed to Viking memory. Chronicles from Christian monks, though written in horror, preserved tales of Viking fearlessness. They described men laughing in death, fighting to the last, accepting fate with joy. To the monks, this was madness. To the Vikings, it was proof of the pact. Their enemies' words became part of their legend. In this way, memory transcended boundaries. The fear of others became the glory of the Norse. But stories were not only about individuals. They also bound communities. Shared sagas gave people identity. To belong to a clan was to inherit its tales, to honor ancestors, to strive to live up to their example. Memory gave continuity, ensuring that each generation renewed the pact. Skalds did not simply record deeds, they inspired new ones. By hearing of heroes, young warriors were emboldened. By hearing of cowards forgotten, they were warned. Story was both reward and punishment. In this sense, the power of memory rivaled even Valhalla. For while Valhalla promised eternity in the halls of the gods, story promised eternity on earth. And unlike Valhalla, which required death in battle, memory could be achieved in other ways. Through leadership, wisdom, or loyalty. In this way, the pact with the gods was mirrored by a pact with community. Courage was the key to both, and cowardice the path to oblivion. The sagas also reveal how deeply story shaped Viking spirituality. They often begin with genealogies tracing families back to gods. This linked human lives directly to divine origins, reinforcing the sense that mortals and gods shared destiny. If Odin could die at Ragnarok, so too could men, but both would be remembered in story. This created unity of fate. Thus, the power of story was not optional, it was essential. Without it, sacrifice meant nothing, courage meant nothing, and death was meaningless. With it, every act became immortal. Skalds were therefore guardians of eternity, their verses as important as swords. The pact with the gods was made real through their words. Today, our knowledge of the Norse world comes largely through story. The Eddas, written centuries after the Viking Age, preserve fragments of oral tradition. Though filtered through Christian scribes, they echo the old beliefs, reminding us that the Vikings themselves valued memory above all. That we still speak of them 1,000 years later proves their success. They achieved what they sought, eternal glory. Their pact with the gods was not only a matter of blood and battle but of voice and verse. Sacrifice paid the price, story delivered the reward. Together, they ensured that the Norse lived without fear and died without despair. In the end, the power of story and memory was as vital as any sword stroke. It was their second Valhalla, their earthly immortality, and perhaps the truest fulfillment of their pact with the gods. As we approach the question of whether the Vikings truly made a pact with the gods for eternal glory, we must step carefully between the realms of myth and reality. The sagas and poems tell us with certainty that warriors believed they would be chosen by Valkyries, lifted to Valhalla, and trained for Ragnarok. Archaeology shows us graves filled with weapons, ships, and amulets, suggesting that death was preparation for another life. Yet historians remind us that these sources are fragmentary, biased, and often filtered through later Christian scribes. The truth of Viking belief lies somewhere between their myths and our evidence, and that truth is complex. On one hand, the myths were clear. Valhalla was not vague hope but described in rich detail. Golden shields for a roof, spears for rafters, endless mead, daily combat, nightly feasts. Half the slain went to Odin, half to Freya in her hall folkvanger. Valkyries rode across battlefields, choosing who would die. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew each day across the world to bring him news. These images appear not only in stories but in art and artifacts. Amulets of Thor's hammer, carvings of Valkyries, and depictions of Odin as one-eyed wanderer prove that myth infused daily life. To the Vikings, gods were not distant but present, their actions woven into storms, harvests, and wars. On the other hand, reality was messier. Not every grave shows signs of warrior belief. Many contain household goods, tools, and jewelry, suggesting hopes for a peaceful afterlife rather than eternal battle. Some graves blend pagan and Christian symbols, showing the transition as Christianity spread in Scandinavia. By the 10th and 11th centuries, many Norse were baptized, yet sagas of Odin and Valhalla still thrived. Belief was not uniform. Some clung fiercely to old gods, others adopted new faiths. Many blended both. This variation complicates the idea of a single pact. For elite warriors, especially those who raided and fought abroad, Valhalla was central. Their culture demanded courage. Their stories promised glory. Their graves show weapons and sacrifices. For farmers and traders, the pact may have been looser, focused more on prosperity in this life than on eternity in Odin's hall. Yet even they lived within the mythic framework. To them, thunder was Thor, the sea was Njord, fate was woven by Norns. In this sense, myth and reality coexisted seamlessly. Another layer of complexity comes from propaganda. Leaders surely used the promise of Valhalla to motivate men. To swear that those who fell would feast with Odin made raids easier to recruit for. Just as medieval kings promised salvation to crusaders, Viking chieftains promised Valhalla to their followers. Did every man believe it literally? Perhaps not. But in battle, belief mattered less than behavior. A man who thought Valkyries watched him would fight harder, laugh at death, and terrify his enemies. Thus, even if belief was partly propaganda, it was effective. Archaeology supports the duality. In Denmark and Sweden, great burial mounds contain ships, weapons, horses, even sacrificed humans, echoing myths of Valhalla. Yet smaller graves show humble offerings, daily tools, simple amulets. This spectrum reveals a society where myth inspired ideals but reality adjusted them. Not everyone could die gloriously, but everyone could participate in the culture of courage. The sagas themselves blur the line between truth and tale. Written down centuries later, they mix history with myth. Battles are recorded alongside appearances of Odin. Heroes like Ragnar may be composites of many men. Yet this does not diminish their truth for the Vikings. They lived in a world where gods were real, fate was inescapable, and story was as important as fact. To them, there was no sharp line between myth and reality. The pact with the gods was both literal and metaphorical, both divine and social. It was divine because they believed Odin demanded courage and promised Valhalla. It was social because communities promised to remember the brave and forget the cowardly. Together, these promises created a powerful system of meaning. Even outsiders noted it. Christian chroniclers wrote of Vikings who laughed in death, who mocked pain, who welcomed fate. To the monks, this was barbarity. To the Vikings, it was glory. Thus, the myth of the pact became real through behavior. Whether Odin truly waited mattered less than whether warriors acted as if he did. In that sense, the pact existed because it was lived. Between myth and reality lay practice. Sacrifices at Uppsala, ship burials, blood sprinkled on idols. All reinforced the bond. Sagas retold by firelight renewed it. Raids enacted it. Death sealed it. The evidence, though fragmentary, points consistently to a culture that saw courage as currency with the divine. So did the Vikings really make a pact with the gods? In historical terms, no written contract exists. In cultural terms, the pact was undeniable. It lived in rituals, in graves, in poems, in the laughter of dying men. It lived in the fear of their enemies and the pride of their families. It lived in the continuity of memory, which even now, more than a millennium later, still tells their story. In this way, myth and reality were not opposites but partners. Myth gave reality meaning, reality gave myth evidence. Together, they formed the foundation of Norse belief. The Vikings lived as if Odin watched, died as if Valkyries waited, and remembered as if memory itself was immortality. That is the space where myth and reality met, and in that space, the pact with the gods was real. So, did the Vikings really make a pact with the gods for eternal glory? After tracing their rituals, their battles, their sacrifices, and their stories, the answer lies not in parchment or signatures but in the way they lived and died. A pact, in our modern sense, is a contract between two parties, sealed by law or promise. For the Vikings, their pact with Odin and the other gods was written in courage, sealed in blood, and remembered in saga. It was not negotiated, it was embraced. Every warrior who raised a sword in defiance of death, every family who carved a rune stone, every skald who sang a poem, all participated in the bargain. And the terms were clear: give courage, receive glory. The sagas told them that those who fought bravely would be chosen by Valkyries, lifted to Valhalla, and prepared for Ragnarok. Archaeology shows graves prepared as if for a journey beyond, weapons laid beside the dead, ships sunk into earth, animals sacrificed, sometimes even humans, as companions for eternity. Rituals of blot spilled blood on altars, feasts dedicated ale and meat to gods, and oaths sworn upon weapons invoked Odin as witness. In every gesture, the pact was renewed. The gods demanded courage, and the people gave it. The gods demanded life, and sacrifices supplied it. In return, warriors believed they would feast in Odin's hall, fight each day, drink each night, and at the end of time, join the gods in the final cosmic struggle. Yet the pact was not only with the divine. It was also with memory. A man who died bravely but was forgotten lost half his reward. A man remembered in saga achieved immortality twice, once in Valhalla, once in story. Communities promised to keep memory alive through skaldic poems, rune stones, and oral tradition. Families honored the fallen by retelling their deeds, neighbors repeated their names, and poets wove their courage into the fabric of myth. In this way, the pact was collective. The warrior offered courage, the gods offered eternity, and the community offered remembrance. Together, they ensured no death was meaningless. Even enemies contributed. Christian monks, horrified, wrote of Viking fearlessness, describing men who laughed at wounds, who welcomed death, who mocked pain. Their accounts, meant as warnings, became part of Viking legend. Outsiders preserved what the Norse themselves claimed, that their warriors were unafraid because they believed death was doorway, not defeat. This convergence of faith and behavior made the pact real. Whether Odin existed mattered less than whether men acted as if he did. And they did. They stormed monasteries, sailed into storms, fought hopeless battles, and in dying bravely, proved their conviction. Belief was reality because it shaped action. But did all Vikings share this faith equally? The evidence shows variation. Not everyone was a warrior. Farmers, women, and traders lived differently. Yet even they existed within the mythic frame. Women prayed to Freya, families made offerings to Thor, farmers left gifts for Freyr. Their lives may not have aimed at Valhalla, but they accepted fate as woven by the Norns and sought meaning in continuity. Even as Christianity spread, many held to the old ways. Some converted, blending Christ with Odin, heaven with Valhalla. But the warrior ideal endured, shaping identity. Even when the gods were abandoned, the value of courage remained. That legacy lingers even now. 1,000 years later, we still speak of Vikings as fearless, as raiders who laughed at death. We still imagine their longships cutting through waves, their warriors charging without fear. Films, novels, and games retell their myths. Historians debate their rituals, but the image of the Viking Pact persists. In this, they achieved eternal glory. Their pact worked. For the question of whether Odin welcomed them to Valhalla may never be answered. But the fact that we remember them proves their immortality. Memory was the true battlefield, and they won. The pact with the gods was not only spiritual but cultural. It demanded courage in life, it promised honor in death, and it secured memory in story. It was a way to make sense of a harsh world, to turn suffering into meaning, and to transform mortality into destiny. The Norse lived with death always near. Winter, disease, famine, war. But instead of fearing it, they embraced it. They turned death into passage, courage into currency, memory into immortality. That was their pact. Eternal glory was not guaranteed by parchment but created by belief. Each Viking who fought as if Odin watched, who died as if Valkyries waited, who was remembered in saga, fulfilled the pact. In truth, they wrote their own eternity. So, did the Vikings really make a pact with the gods for eternal glory? Yes, because they believed it, lived it, and died by it. And belief made it real. Their pact was not legend alone but legacy. A legacy that outlived even their gods. Today, we still speak their names, still tell their stories, still admire their courage. In this, they achieved what they sought. Their pact was not broken by time, for we are proof that their memory endures. Eternal glory was not only in Valhalla. It is here, in our voices, in our imagination, in history itself.